This is the place, the making of modern Mormon myth. From the time Thomas Jefferson secured the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. government began funding a series of expeditions to explore and survey the western frontier of North America. Most expeditions proceeded under the direct supervision of the Army Corps of Engineers, led by such notable officers as George Meade and John C. Fremont. Among the responsibilities of the Corps was discovering the most effective routes for moving people westward, fulfilling the manifest destiny of the United States. One of the roadblocks along the path of settling the Pacific coast was getting people from the east quickly and inexpensively. To that point, only three travel options existed: sailing around South America, traversing the rugged Rocky Mountains, and sailing to Panama, transporting goods by land across the isthmus, and then loading onto a second ship to complete the voyage. Each option was costly and time-consuming. Then, in 1830, just as Joseph Smith was organizing his new religion, officials in Washington began developing their own new plan. Less than a decade earlier, the first large-scale steam-powered locomotives were developed in Great Britain. As this new technology was introduced to the United States, government leaders envisioned a railroad that could carry passengers from Atlantic to Pacific cheaply and in mere days rather than months. Over the next several years, politicians waged debates as to how to accomplish the railroad construction and, more specifically, which route would be followed. At this point, some may say, what does the Transcontinental Railroad have to do with Brigham Young and the first wave of pioneers? After all, railroad plans weren't finalized until the mid-1850s, several years after the Mormons were established in the Utah Territory. Finalized, yes, but as we are about to learn, there was much work going on both publicly and behind closed doors for more than 2 decades prior. Public support for the railroad construction was seen as early as 1832. Prominent New York businessman Dr. Hartwell Carver submitted a proposal to Congress that was dismissed. Following that disappointment, he began publishing a series of articles which appeared in the New York Courier and Inquirer promoting a rail route to the Pacific. Carter would continue writing articles on the subject for the next several years and was present at the driving of the Golden Spike in 1869. His 1875 obituary proclaims Dr. Carver the father of the Pacific Railroad. The first approved legislation to begin construction on the Pacific Railroad was introduced to Congress by Representative Zadok Pratt in 1845. Asa Whitney, a distant cousin of cotton gin inventor Eli Whitney, who had championed the bill, led a team across a portion of one proposed route to assess its feasibility in June that same year. The United States once again needed the Army to begin laying the groundwork for the trail that would eventually become the Transcontinental Railroad. Eventually, the central route, starting from Chicago and ending at the port of San Francisco, became the most favored choice. But there was just one problem. San Francisco and the California Territory still belonged to Mexico, and Mexico wasn't interested in handing over the richest plot of land on earth so easily. Therefore, the two nations commenced what would become a 2-year conflict in April 1846. With the Army called into action, establishing the roadbed for the Pacific Railroad would have to either be put on hold or contracted to a civilian company. And it just so happened there was one such collection of able-bodied workers at hand who not only had a wealth of construction experience, but were also temporarily homeless, unemployed, and desperate for any potential income opportunities. It's quite possible that Jesse Little's 1846 negotiations with the Army, which included sending 500 Mormons to serve in the Mexican War, also detailed plans for the Saints to help establish the trail that would guide railroad construction through its most difficult section, the Rocky Mountains. Brigham Young's 1847 Vanguard Pioneer Company served a dual purpose. exploring potential sites for their future home, and forming the infrastructure for the future transcontinental railroad. Perhaps the reason why this job description was not common knowledge among rank and file members is because Young did not want his workers to know they were each earning wages from the government for their service. In this case, he, and thus the church, could maintain complete control of funds and expenditures, ergo the secrecy of the negotiation process. Or perhaps these 142 men did understand their job duties but were sworn to secrecy. Just 2 decades later, as the Transcontinental Project neared completion, Mormon leaders recalled their experiences of the time. In a mass meeting held in Salt Lake City on June 1868 to give considerations to the coming railroad, George A. Smith, soon to become a counselor to Brigham Young in the presidency of the LDS Church, reminded his audience that it really was the Mormons who had pioneered the route for the Pacific Railroad. In April 1847, President Young and 143 pioneers left Council Bluffs and located and made the road to the site of this city. A portion of our labor was to seek out a way for the railroad across the continent, and every place we found that seemed difficult for laying the railroads, we searched a way for the road to go around or through it. Brigham Young himself publicly corroborated this notion on at least 2 separate occasions. At that same 1868 mass meeting, he followed Smith, saying, "As there are a great many persons present who know nothing concerning our first arrival in these valleys, I want to say, concerning the railroad, that I do not suppose we traveled one day from the Missouri River here, but what we looked for a track where the rails could be laid with success, for a railroad through this territory to go to the Pacific Ocean. When we came here over the hills and plains in 1847, we made our calculations for a railroad across the country." What were these calculations President Young mentioned? 2 years later, during his 1870 Pioneer Day speech, Young stated, "Here let me make this remark. It is not gold seekers who visit us now. We have an entirely different class of men since the railroad was built. The hue and cry was, 'The Mormons do not like the railroad. The Mormons do not want a railroad. The Mormons will not have a railroad.' We never traveled a day, and I can call my brethren to witness the truth of what I assert from that time we crossed the Missouri to this point. But what we were looking for a track for the railroad, and we had not been here long before we petitioned Congress to build a railroad as well as for a government." The initial Mormon expedition of 1847 ran more like a military campaign than a group of settlers traveling to their new home. Discipline of the Pioneer Company was strict and practical. The bugle blew at 5 o'clock in the morning when all were to rise, assemble for prayers, feed the cattle, and get breakfast. At 7 o'clock the second bugle gave the signal for starting. Wherever practical, 2 wagons moved abreast, and in case an Indian attack was threatened, they were to move 5 or 6 abreast. Each man was required to walk beside his wagon, loaded gun in hand, and never leave the wagon nor lay down the gun without permission of his captain. The Mormons were traveling up the left or north bank of the Platte. The Oregon Trail lay to the south of the river, a well-broken route for those days, on which good pasture and company for the protection from the Indians was assured. But Brigham Young decided that the Mormons would keep north of the Platte, at least until they reached Fort Laramie. They were a peculiar people seeking a place to build a peculiar Zion, and they would go by their own peculiar trail. And thus it came that Brigham broke the old Mormon road, now followed mile after mile by the Union Pacific Railroad. While traversing Nebraska Territory, Young sent a letter back to the Saints in winter quarters on May 4th. In it he describes the company's present activities and includes the instruction, "The immigration companies will notice boards and mark trees at our company's plants. If the feed is good on this side the Platte, the next company may continue further up on this side if they choose, and on to Fort Laramie. This statement implies that he did not consider his own group to be included among the immigration companies. Brigham's company was involved in making some plans, which served another purpose besides merely immigrating. Furthermore, his was the only company expected to follow their prescribed route, giving future companies the choice of trails to follow. Young concludes the paragraph of the letter, adding, after they get above Fort Laramie, they can easily follow our trail by watching for signs, for we shall take the most southern route to the Salt Lake we can find. This is the oldest extant document where we see intentions of traveling to the Salt Lake, in Brigham Young's own words. However, the mention of his company's plans, combined with his interest in finding a more southern route, begs the question, what was the real reason Brigham Young was traveling toward the Salt Lake? Was he following divine inspiration or the instructions of an employer? At this point, we should pause and ask some questions. Let's assume for a moment the official LDS narrative happened as they said it did, and that my wild theories are based on pure speculation. If Brigham and Joseph had known and been revealing details of their visions to their followers for more than a decade, why does most of the documented reality of what these pioneers were doing at the time not reflect this foreknowledge? The Vanguard Company of 1847 was not a collection of families settling in their new home. This group of 142 men, 3 women, and 2 children had an even higher ratio of men than even the Mormon battalion, a known military campaign. If these saints already knew where they were settling, why didn't they bring their families? Why did Brigham and the other leaders have to return to winter quarters when they would begin bringing their families to Utah in 1848? Why did Brigham describe his party in different terms than others that followed? If this party were just pioneers emigrating to a new home, why did they not use the well-established Oregon Trail and instead make their travel exponentially more difficult? And then, why did the exact route they traveled later become the path for the Union Pacific Railroad from Omaha all the way to Fort Laramie? It should be noted that while construction was taking place on the Transcontinental Railroad, immigrants were still moving west. Had those two entities been occupying the same trail, it would be rather inconvenient for both. Finally, why was it necessary for his party to travel north of the Platte, but all future parties were given the choice of route to follow?